Who was here last week? Put your hands up if you were here last week. All right. Who remembers what we were talking about? Joshua is a good guess, but we left the judges behind and we actually... Nope, no, we're not to the kings yet. We're right in between. We're talking about a lady. Do you remember the lady's name? No, not Delilah. Good guess, but no, we left Delilah behind too. Do you know? Chili. Actually, that's almost right, because there was a man who was named Chilion, right? Or Chilion. So, what was the lady's name that we're talking about? Deborah. We talked about a Deborah, but that was a couple months ago. What do you think, Dimitri? Ruth. We're talking about the lady named Ruth. And if you remember, Ruth was not a Jew, right? She was the wife of a man of Judah whose father and brother went into Moab when there was a famine. What's a famine? Do you know what a famine is? Who knows what a famine is besides Dimitri? What's a famine, Vasily? A lack of food. So there wasn't enough food. All the supermarkets were empty. I'm kidding. Were there supermarkets? There are supermarkets now, but there were not supermarkets then. Nope. There were farms, and the food wasn't growing. And because maybe there wasn't enough rain in Israel, so they went somewhere else. And they got their food, and they lived there for a while. And the two sons, they got married to women of Moab. Were those Moabite women worshipers of the one true God? What do you think? No. And we don't want to talk about the God of Moab because he was not a nice God. There were terrible things that people who worshipped him did. So, Ruth is coming from a strange place. In fact, the law says a man from Moab isn't ever allowed to come into the children of Israel because something was so wrong there. But they got married. And then, you remember, Naomi, all of the men died, and the older woman, Naomi was her name, she decided, yes, you found my Petra Healy. She decided that she was going to go back to Israel, and she told her two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, to go. And Ruth said, no, I'm going to stay with you, and I know what you are like, so I want to worship your God, because I can tell he is the one true God, and because I love you, I'm going to go with you. So Naomi and Ruth went back to the town that they had started in, which was, does anybody remember? What do you think, Dimitri? Well, Israel is the country, but what is the town? What do you think, Justin? Bethlehem. We know about Bethlehem, don't we? Right. And why did Mary and Joseph go back there? Because that was David's city. And they were descended from David. That's going to make sense in a little while. So anyway, here's what happens. Ruth and Naomi go back, but they're both widows. They can't work. It's not like they have a job that they're going back to, right? So how do they make their living? I'll tell you. There was a custom. This is actually according to the law. And God told everybody that owned land and raised grain that they were allowed to reap the grain, but when they went around, there were going to be sort of the edges and the little pieces that fell, and they weren't allowed to go and grab all that stuff. All the extra grain that fell on the ground. They were able to grab the stalks, but any grain that fell onto the ground or was off on the edges, they weren't allowed to pick it up. This is what God told them in the law. Who do you think God was reserving that grain that fell by the wayside for? What would you think? For the animals? That would be a guess. For the birds? You would do that now. But I'll tell you what, no. For people who need it. Bravo, Supanayoti. That's good. You shouldn't be afraid to guess, because usually the Bible actually makes sense. Believe it or not. So it was for the poor people. So Naomi said to Ruth, because she was younger and could get down and pick things up more easily. Naomi was kind of old and had a hard time bending over. So Ruth went and she was picking up the grain. And then she came back and told Naomi, I actually got a lot today because the man who owned the vineyard, owned the field, was very generous. And Naomi said, well, what was his name? And Ruth said, his name was Boaz. Have you ever met anybody named Boaz? Really? I want to know about that game, but not right now. Okay. In the coffee hour or sometime you can tell me about the game where there's somebody named Boaz. I've never met anybody named Boaz. Okay? Well, it was probably Boaz or something, but even so, I've never met anyone named Boaz either. Have you? I didn't think so. And Naomi says, guess what? Boaz is the close relative of your dead husband. And under the law, you can ask him to marry you. Is that what you expected we were going to go? Okay. Well, but here's the thing. Ruth and Naomi, they don't have anyone to take care of them. And Ruth is working hard, going and picking up the grain, but she kind of needs a husband. She was widowed very young. She never had any children. She's all alone in the world. And when her mother-in-law dies, she'll be all alone. So Ruth goes and she asks Boaz if he'll marry her. And I'm not going to go into the story, although I'll tell you, if you want to read it, it's actually it's a sweet little story. But Boaz says, okay. And he marries her. So this girl from Moab, you might as well say a Turk. Okay. Nobody laughed. Okay. But we might. She was from the enemy of her people, of Israel. But she came in and she became part of the children of Israel. And I'll tell you who she was, because this will make sense. So, Ruth and Boaz got married, and they had a baby. And they named the baby Obed. Obed. Like, oh, the bed. Obed. But Obed had a son, and I bet you've met someone who had this name. Obed's son was Jesse. Ever met anybody named Jesse? Okay, Jesse is a name that we actually know. But Jesse in the Bible had a lot of sons, and his youngest son was someone important. Anybody know who Jesse's son was? David. So this is who we're talking about. We're talking about not David's mother, that would be Jesse's wife, and not David's grandmother, that would be Obed's wife. We're talking about David's great-grandmother, Ruth from Moab, who loved her mother-in-law and loved God and came in. So, this is an interesting story about where David came from. And next time we're going to start talking about, well, not quite to David yet, but we'll start in towards that. All right? Very good. Now stand up. Let's take communion. And remember, don't leave. After you take communion, go sit down in those pews. Understand? Kids, after you take communion, go sit in those pews because we're going to have a procession.